Good evening, Trinidad and Tobago, and good evening to the world. This is your address for Talk City 91.1 FM, and what a fabulous evening it is. It's Wednesday, which means it's time for Indaba, where knowledge grows. Thank you so much, of course, to the Emancipation Support Committee for ensuring that knowledge is spread right here, not just on Talk City 91.1 FM and Sweet TNT, but throughout the world. Very excited for this evening's conversation, talking about the African Export and Import Bank. Great conversation there. Also going on, of course, to none other than Shabaka Kambon, Dr. Claudius Fergus, and so much more with His Excellency Ambassador David Kimisong, and so much more. Get ready for your knowledge to grow. This is in Daba. Good evening, team, and welcome.
Greetings.
Yes,
Alafia
greetings,
to one and
greetings.
all.
Yes, greetings,
Absolutely.
everyone. To our
It is indeed
Indaba
a pleasure to have you back.
community who are either on Facebook or following us on YouTube, or of course just listening live on 91.1 FM. Without further ado, we have in studio this evening, as of course, our brother, Reverend Kwame Kamo, who has been doing human service these days. Congratulations, my brother. You are so great on the team. But Indaba wants to welcome once again, he was here just recently, His Excellency David Kimisong, who is Barbados' ambassador to CARICOM, but he's also chairman of the Caribbean Pan-African Network. And interestingly, I will come to that in a while, and I would want to get some feedback from you, not feedback, but really explanation how it is CARICOM has sort of graduated into the sixth region of the African Union when, prior it would have been the global diaspora. So perhaps you can explain that for us. Because what we are going to talk about, in fact, involves, in a sense, the sixth region, the Africa Export-Import Bank, AFREXIM Bank. You may have heard Prime Minister Mia Mottley deliver a sterling address at the United Nations last week, as usual, I should say. But this evening, we are going to speak about one of her major projects. I know she was very instrumental in getting the AFREXIM Bank located in Barbados. This bank has been in operation for about 30 years now. It's headquartered in Cairo, which is the main city in one of the five regions on continental Africa. Well, the African Union, because about 5 or 6 states of the African Union are not on the African continent. I think some people are not fully aware of that when we talk about, the motherland, the continent. There's a continent, and there are these 5 states which are not on the continent. Nevertheless, there are regional headquarters of the bank as well in each of the 5 regions, and now we see a branch being established in Barbados, and we welcome that. So if you can put that in context in terms of the regional headquartering of the bank, in terms of the bank's arrival in the Caribbean and the bank's location in Barbados, does that make Barbados the unofficial headquarters of the 6th region? So tell us something about that, my brother. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Fergus. Thank you, Ambassador Reverend Kwame. It's a pleasure to be here, always a pleasure, and to share with my Trinidadian and Tobagonian brothers and sisters. I think the first thing we have to clear up is this slight misinformation that the Caribbean community is now the 6th region of Africa. You had it correct. It's the African diaspora that is the 6th region of Africa, and the Caribbean community is a component of that 6th region of Africa. But I think I
No,
think
what we are correcting here, David, is some blazing headlines recently that CARICOM is the sixth region, and it is in that context that I mentioned it for you to
yes,
clear up for us. How
I saw
come?
the headlines.
So yeah,
I
I
saw
wanted to clear that.
I saw the headlines, and I think it
Yes.
was just that former Prime Minister P.J. Patterson probably expressed himself a little loosely, and the news media ran with his words. So I think that's where the headline came from, an address made by Honorable P.J. Patterson. But really and truly, CARICOM is a component of the diaspora, which has been designated by the African Union back in 2008 as the sixth region. And as Trinidadians and Tobagonians should know, that Trinidad and Tobago and the Emancipation Support Committee in particular played a very big role in that designation of the diaspora as a sixth region, because the technical workshop that worked out all of those definitions for the African Union of what is the African diaspora, what is a person of African descent. That technical workshop was held in Trinidad in the year 2003. So that did a lot of the groundwork that led in 2008 to the designation of the diaspora as the sixth region. I had the honor to be there at that workshop in 2003, and the following year we met in Barbados and we established the Caribbean Pan-African Network as a Caribbean network to work with the African Union. In fact, we were preparing for the institutionalizing of the concept of the diaspora being the sixth region. And this idea of the diaspora being the sixth region is the development that permitted the African Export-Import Bank to extend its arms to the Caribbean community. That's what they said. They said, the bank was, you're quite right, the bank was established in 1994. But the bank was established really to focus on intra-African trade and development. And yes, some export trade as well. But President Benedict Orama, the head of the bank, when he spoke to the Caribbean communities, heads of government in the Bahamas earlier this year, he said that it was that decision to designate the diaspora as the sixth region that gave them the green light to do what they're doing now, to reach out to the diaspora. And so you're quite right, the headquarters of the bank is in Cairo. It has it has 5 regional offices on the African continent, places like Kigali and Nigeria and various other parts of the continent. And now it has its 6th regional office in the Caribbean. Now it happens to be located in Barbados, but it's not a Barbados office. It is a Caribbean community office. So for example, when I spoke to the office manager this afternoon in preparation for this program, he was in Suriname. He had been in Guyana and Suriname. He was heading off for the Bahamas. So it is very much a regional operation. And Barbados is just the headquarters for all of the regional activity that even now is ongoing as they put their Caribbean program in place.
Okay, let me ask you one more question before I invite Brother Kwame to address the issue. Now, just a little quick, by the way. It seems to me that CARICOM has become the capital region of the 6th region as such.
And
I,
so
I,
should we. And so should it be.
yes, 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 because we have always played that leading role, I think, and has been recognized as well, because I think it has only been CPAN that has had representation on ECOSOC. You can correct that if I am wrong when you're answering this question. Now, in respect of the AFTA, AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is also served by the Afrexim Bank. In fact, the bank is supposed to accelerate, developments in terms of intercontinental free trade, well, inter-African free trade. Now, what kind of window does the Afrexim Bank in the Caribbean now give us in terms of free trade with the continent? Seeing that the bank is here and we have always been talking about transatlantic trade with the continent, I know a little bit of that goes on, but how can that be expanded and promoted by the presence?
Yes, I think Dr. Fergus probably just stuck there for a moment, but I'll answer his question. This African Continental Free Trade Area is very exciting because you're talking about a free trade area of 12 million square miles, 1.4 billion people, and some 54 different states. Tremendous. Now, if we are still in the process of developing our CARICOM single market and single economy. So well, in fact, we are more than we already have a free trade space, but we are going beyond free trade space to a single market and single economy. But what a wonderful thing it would be if we could link our CSME, our free trade space, with the African continental free trade space, so that we then have access to the 1.4 billion potential market of the African continent. Now, one of the ways the African Exim Bank is deemed to be a crucial financial institution in making the African continental free trade area a success. Because, I mean, its whole raison d'etre is to finance and to facilitate trade and investment. And one of the vehicles that they established and launched just last year to do just that is something called the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System. This is an African system for doing trade between different African countries without having to use the hard currencies of the world, the American dollar and the British pound, etc., and to do trade, to organize the payments in such a seamless way that you cut down on transaction costs and so forth. And the good news is that we are going to be trying to transfer the African Pan-African payments and settlement system to the Caribbean community. In fact, right now, and for some months now, the African Exim Bank has been in discussions with the central bankers of CARICOM. So this is a project that is already underway. It has been discussed for several months now. And soon from now, it is my understanding that they're going to roll out a pilot project. So if we can get the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System applied to CARICOM, it will help us in our own intra-CARICOM trade, not to have to be using these outside currencies and make it much more efficient and cut down on the costs. But it would then, once we can establish that here in the Caribbean, it means that it will be a relatively simple process then to link it with the system as it works on the African continent, thereby making trade between Africa and the Caribbean much easier. So that is one of the exciting projects that the bank has
Indeed.
brought to our region.
Absolutely, absolutely. As I pick up from where Dr. Fergus has left off, I'm wondering what are the plethora of services that are available from the Afri-Exim Bank headquartered there in Barbados on behalf of you are advising us the entire CARICOM region. I can think of persons who are involved in um, the agricultural sector. I can think of persons involved in real estate. I can think of persons who are involved in mining. I can think of persons who are involved from the CARICOM and from the diaspora, involved in all of these various types of projects on the continent. So there are a number of persons listening on tonight, and they are curious to find out, can individuals access financing? I'm advised that some 1.5 billion US is available within the group for development. Is that individual? Is that at the level of the institutions, the private sector, or is that exclusive, as it is with the ADB, the African Development Bank? We also have the new development bank coming out of the BRICS, the new kid on the block, powerful, greater GDP than the G7 when combined, a force to be reckoned with, a freak of nature, some are calling it. But these funds within these larger banks are usually made available to governments so that they can engage in what we call development financing, so that they wouldn't have to approach the IMF and World Bank as an alternative. With regards to this bank so close to our shores, actually on yours, does it spell opportunity for individuals and institutions within the private sector, or is it exclusive to the governments of the Caribbean?
Well, let's give a little background about the bank. So the African Exportation Bank is public-private institution that was established under a treaty that brought together all of the African Union governments. So it is quasi-governmental. Governments are partners, but it's also private sector. The unique thing about it is that it has to be 75% African owned. So written into its constitution, no less than 75% of the shares must be African owned. So it was established almost 30 years ago. Since then, it's burst over 90 billion US dollars in that period of time. It has assets of 30-something billion dollars. So by Caribbean standards, this is a giant institution. We should also say that when we talk about the bank, it is much more than just a bank. It is actually a group of companies, and it does many things besides banking services, from developing industrial products, developing hospitals, insurance management, a whole set of functions. Now, the bank held an African Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum in Barbados last year, in collaboration with CARICOM and with the government of Barbados. Some 1,200 delegates from 41 different African countries came to that forum. There were something like 1,700 people at that forum, including many of the CARICOM governments. At that forum, a partnership agreement was open for signing between the bank and CARICOM governments. So far, about 9 or 10 CARICOM governments have signed on as partners of the bank. So the CARICOM governments that have signed on are in a similar position to the African governments that are members of the bank. And on the basis of the CARICOM governments that signed on, the board of directors of the bank determined that the bank will allocate 1.5 billion US dollars in the first instance to finance trade and investment projects between Africa and the Caribbean. And they have said that if and when the other CARICOM countries come on board, and the principal ones are really Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica, the two big ones that have not yet come on board, that once they come on board, they will increase that 1.5 billion US to 3 billion US. They will double it. So that is what is at our disposal to access, to finance trade and investment projects. Now, the bank has started doing two things. Number one, it has started bringing African investors into the Caribbean. So, for example, the bank started coming to the Caribbean in October of 2021 and has not stopped since then. It has brought several trade missions to our region, and a number of African investors are actually doing projects in the Caribbean. So, for example, in Barbados, there's an Egyptian company that is doing a fish farming,
Wonderful.
and fish processing project in Barbados. The bank has also been talking to Caribbean business people who are interested, who have projects that they would like to have investment capital. So one of the things, so the bank manager, the headquarters manager, is moving across the Caribbean, and he assured me this afternoon that they're talking to business people in the various countries, including in Trinidad and Tobago. So he said to me that they're still discussing with Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica about signing on to the partnership agreement. But even while they are doing that, they're not excluding business enterprises from Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica. So they're speaking to them. They're speaking to them as well. Now, in terms of small and medium-sized Caribbean businesses and how they will benefit. Because I personally raised this with the bank. I mean, we put the cards on the table. All of these years, the Pan-Africanists of the Caribbean, we have been the ones clamoring for this kind of relationship. We don't want, when this kind of relationship finally materializes, that it is monopolized by the traditional business sector. No, it must be for the benefit of our people, African people, African business people who tend in our Caribbean space to be the smaller business enterprises. So the bank is very conscious of this. They say that they have a program to deal with this, to make sure that they are reaching out to the small and medium-sized businesses of the Caribbean. But I have raised this as well with our state entities in Barbados. In Barbados, the two state entities that are most directly engaged with the bank are Invest Barbados and Export Barbados. And these are entities of the Barbados Investment and Development Corporation. So it is now the responsibility of those state agencies to mobilize the small and medium-sized Barbadian businesses, to bring them together, to prepare them, to get them ready, to give them the information, but also to help them to organize themselves and to prepare them to engage with the bank and to make use of the benefits that the bank and the opportunities that the bank is bringing to our region. So it is going to have to work both ways, Kwame. Our governmental agencies are going to have to play that role of reaching out to, mobilizing, small and medium-sized entities, giving them the relevant information, preparing them to engage with the bank. And the bank itself understands that this is a danger it has to avoid. But we are the ones who know the terrain. The bank is a visitor, to our home. We
Absolutely.
know the terrain. We are the ones who have to take primary responsibility for organizing our small and medium enterprises.
I'm hearing a phone ringing there. I'm wondering if someone calling into the studio. Such a
No,
hot
no, no,
topic.
that's me. I keep getting knocked out, so I was calling Renee to get her
Sure,
back.
sure, no problem, no problem. I have another question for you in the few minutes we have left for the feature. Of course, unless you, Baba, have a pressing one, I'll give way to you, of course. And it had to do
No,
with the
you go
issue
ahead. You go ahead.
of
I have a question, but
criteria.
you go ahead.
It
I'll
had to do
ask
with
him
the
during the break. Yeah, you
yeah,
go
it
ahead.
had to do with the issue of criteria in terms of who qualifies. Usually when you approach the banks, most of them in the Caribbean operate from a perspective where the small to medium sized businesses tend to not get the money that they want. You have to have money to make money is an open secret in the Caribbean. And more than that, if you are darker than a brown paper bag, you have even more problems. I know persons who have certain government and private sector contracts and they can't have access to loans. It seems that when they enter the offices of the bank, that the criteria changes all of a sudden on them. With regards to the criteria, does it require a certain amount of a tenure in business, a certain amount of share capital? You spoke to the 75% being black owned. That is so powerful, thumbs way up to ensure that there's some kind of affirmative action baked into it. But in terms of criteria and accessibility, what is required? Do we need to have our government sign off and act as a recommender, or is this free of government? And I don't want to use the word interference, but is the word that comes clearest to mind. Can the private sector really engage the bank as is necessary and expedient without necessarily having to have the nod of their local governments and agencies acting necessarily as a recommender and as a guarantor, in terms of their criteria portfolio?
Well, I'm certain that the private sector can engage the bank independently of governments because, as I was informed today, even though Trinidad and Tobago's government is not a partner, they have not signed, the bank is still talking to Trinidadian and Tobagonian business interests. But as to all of the criteria for loans and so forth, I'm afraid I don't have that information. I can't answer those questions with precision. I guess, the bank only established a headquarters in Barbados in early August. So it's still early days yet. But let me just quote some of the words of President Benedict Orama when he addressed the
Please.
CARICOM heads of government in February of this year, right? Um, Honorable Prime Ministers, I would like to inform you that Afri-Exim Bank remains most optimistic about the future of our regions. Let me assure you that the partnership we have formed is bound by blood. For us at Afri-Exim Bank, this is unshakable. As we have done for Africa, so shall we do for the Caribbean. So he was at pains to point out that they are conscious of the blood tie. They are conscious that we are family, and this is what binds us together. And the bank is conscious that it is not just and it is not just another commercial institution. That we are on a mission to fulfill our Pan-Africanist destiny, to fulfill our Pan-Africanist destiny. So the bank is conscious that it has to play that kind of historic role on behalf of these people centuries ago, these family members that were pulled apart centuries ago, and we are now coming back together again. So I think the bank has that consciousness. I don't think we need worry about the consciousness of this institution. In fact, this is an institution, that intervenes whenever there's a crisis in Africa. For example, when the international banks are carrying out their de-risking, just as they're de-risking in the Caribbean, and many of them are abandoning African countries because they think it's not worth it. The bank is actually financing African business people to buy up those banks and to keep those banks running. So whenever there's a crisis, whether it was the pandemic, whether it was the commodity crisis in 2015, this bank understands that it is there to carry out a historic role on behalf of the African people to make sure that we are a success story. It's not just about making money. It is about guiding the success of our continent, of our African Union, of our African countries and governments and people.
Okay, David, the red flag is up. We have to close the session, but I want to throw one final question at you. I know you may not have a specific answer for it, but could we fulfill our destiny, as you say, with a bank that has its holdings in US dollars? You know the implication of US dollars in terms of it being used, weaponized as such against whoever, the United States may fall out of favor with. Is it not time for us to be looking seriously at a continental currency, common currency? Is that part of the concerns of the bank at all at this point in time? Briefly answer.
Well, I really can't say. But we don't have to just look to Africa. We look at the Caribbean, CARICOM. There's a sense that we have a sense that our CARICOM single market and single economy will eventually end up at a common currency. That, in a sense, that will be the final building block of the single economy. And I would imagine that the African Union has a similar conception. I guess the question is, how soon do we get there? I think we plan to get there in CARICOM as well. The question, and I suspect the same is true for the African continent, but how soon do we get there? But I think all over the world now, there's countries have woken up to the danger of an international financial system dominated by the United States, because the United States has been, as we all know, has been very irresponsible in how it has weaponized that system, how it has applied all kinds of sanctions and shut countries out of the financial system. I mean, we only have to look at our regional neighbors, Cuba and Venezuela. But all over the world now, people are picking up on the danger of that. And we can clearly see that there are all kinds of moves afoot to ensure that situation does not persist very much longer into the future. And I think that is part of our evolving consciousness in the Caribbean as well. And things like the Pan-African payment system, that kind of mechanism is actually designed to wean us off of having to rely so much on these North American and European hard currencies, and instead to use our own currencies to be the medium for trade between ourselves. So the bank is the African Exim Bank is actually leading the way in that respect, and we can only hope that the Pan-African payment system that they have launched in Africa just last year, that it will be a success, and that the experiment that they are undertaking with our own central banks to apply it to to our Caribbean region, that too will be a success, and then we will join the two together. We will link together. So I think we are well on our way to dealing with the danger that you have identified.
Okay, at this point, my brother, Ambassador David Commission, we want to thank you for all of your ideas that you have brought to the show as usual, and we hope to see you again soon. You know, this conversation has to continue. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm always here at the disposal of the Emancipation Support Committee, an organization that I have utmost respect for, and of course, for our elder leader, our veteran, Brother Kafra Cambon. So you can call upon
Indeed.
me at any time.
Thank you. We will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, see you guys.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yes, so we now move to the next segment of tonight's program, and that's the Africa Report. We have a presentation, but let me just contextualize it first. A video presentation. It's about a speech that was made at the United Nations General Assembly last week. And of course, the UN saw ambassador, Trinidad's ambassador, well, Trinbagonian ambassador, Dennis Francis as the president of the United Nations beginning this month. I'm not sure how long the term of office runs for, but we congratulate him nonetheless. And those who also would have sponsored that move. A decade ago, we had a Ghanaian former president, John Kufuor, as Secretary General. I'm saying so because, you know, we generally look forward to something happening, and because of these important positions held by these prominent Black diplomats. So we look forward. I say no more on that for now. Now, I listened to many of the African presidents' speeches. South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa traveled to the General Assembly with a woman-only contingent, and he was the only African head of state to do so. And of course, this was a first for women diplomats and technocrats at the United General Assembly, United Nations. Now, I think there were some common themes, at least, you know, I could discern some of them in most of the speakers. For example, there was a widespread chastisement of the United Nations itself for being obsolete, dysfunctional, undemocratic, unrepresentative as a facilitator of imperialist exploitation of Africa.
Really clear.
Yes, they accuse the United Nations of being paralyzed when it comes to dealing with the exploitation of by its privileged members, particularly, you know, exploitation of the African continent. Perhaps the second most common concern was combating climate change. Of course, that is hitting Africa very, very hard. So you know what happened in Libya just recently, and a lot of that is continuing.
Morocco.
Yes, in Morocco as well. So all over the continent, you know, the desiccation and then flooding. So it's from one to the next. The third was continental security. The fourth, I think, strident calls were made for ending the criminal embargo against Cuba, as you heard Brother Commission said, Zimbabwe, Niger, Mali, Venezuela, and others. But to me, it was refreshing to hear many speakers remind the world of the inequities of the Atlantic slave trade, of slavery, of colonialism, and they tend to put that in the context of where they are now in terms of, you know, the challenges that the continent is facing now. And this was sometimes accompanied by a call for reparations. The most recent appeal I found came from Ghana's president, Nana Akufo-Addo, whose presentation you would hear as this week's Africa Report. At the end of the report, I put a short clip from Kenya's renowned professor of law, P.L.O. Lumumba, as a sort of conclusion to Nana Addo's presentation. So without further ado, Renee, please run the clip for us, please.
Looking forward to it.
We do not seek to shirk any responsibility for the problems we face that are of our own making. And it bears repeating that we are not craving for sympathy, and we do not want to be a scar on anybody's conscience. But we cannot, and the world should not pretend that the present-day economic and social conditions of Africa have nothing to do with the historical injustices that have fashioned the structures of the world. It is time to acknowledge openly that much of Europe and the United States have been built from the vast wealth harvested from the sweat, tears, blood, and horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and the centuries of colonial exploitation. Maybe we should also admit that it cannot be easy to build confident and prosperous societies from nations that for centuries have their natural resources looted and their peoples traded as commodities. For centuries, the world has been unwilling and unable to confront the realities of the consequences of the slave trade. But gradually, this is changing, and it is time to bring the subject of reparations firmly to the fore. Granted, the current generations are not the ones that engaged in the slave trade, but that grand inhuman enterprise was state-sponsored and deliberate, and its benefits are clearly interwoven with the present-day economic architecture of the nations that designed and executed it. Reparations must be paid for the slave trade. No amount of money will ever make up for the horrors, but it would make the point that evil was perpetrated, that millions of productive Africans were snatched from the embrace of our continent and put to work in the Americas and the Caribbean without compensation for their labor. If there are any hesitations in some minds about the paying of reparations, it is worth considering the fact that when slavery was abolished, the slave owners were compensated for the loss of the slaves because the human beings were labeled as property, deemed to be commodities. Surely, this is a matter that the world must confront and can no longer ignore. The African Union has authorized Ghana to hold a global conference on the issue in November in Accra. It is probably also the time to return to that vexed subject of illicit financial outflows out of the continent of Africa. I refer to the report of the panel chaired by the highly respected former South African President Thabo Mbeki on the illicit flow of funds from Africa, which states that Africa is losing annually more than 88 billion United States dollars through illicit financial outflows. Yes, those monies too must be returned to the continent. It is difficult to understand why the recipient countries are comfortable about retaining such funds and are happy to call those countries from whom the monies are taken as corrupt. I believe that a joint task force of the African Union Commission and the OECD Secretariat under the auspices of the United Nations should be charged to find ways of stopping the damaging outflows.
The British have never faced justice. That is why they still run around the world pretending to tell us what to do. You know, one of the most painful statements that I ever heard in my life was from a former British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, when he said that Africa is a scar on the conscience of the world. How dare he? It is because we have never asked them to answer for their atrocities. The day they do, they will know that we are truly angry. They have never. And that is why some of us are very serious about this whole idea of reparations and proper apology. They have never apologized.
Yes, so that's your Africa report for this evening. For the short few minutes that we have left in this segment, I would like to hear the views of the reparations ambassador, Brother Kwame.
Well, first of all, you're always on point, and thank you so much for returning to the program. You bring an air of covering, certainly, and of edification. I always grow 2 inches whenever you're in the room. It certainly has been my favorite speech thus far with regards to the debate, in particular on the issue of reparations. I am thankful that the ambassador who has just left, in the person of Ambassador David Commission, is going to be part of that delegation that is going to be going to Accra, Ghana, to discuss this very important issue. With the 50 states of the African Union, plus, of course, the states of the CARICOM region coming together, that allows for a significant amount of power and sway within the United Nations or any other multilateral institution for that matter. And I do expect that it is not going to be business as usual. Africa, it seems, Dr. Fergus, has found its voice, whether it is in the form of bloodless coups and uprisings, whether it's in the form of what we are seeing taking place in terms of the speeches being given without apology, speaking to issues current and relevant, when it has to do with the internal organizing that we see taking place in Africa to address their own needs. Certainly, Africa's future beams very, very brightly. Pio Lumumba is an absolute favorite of mine, and I know it is shared between us. One of the things that one of the Facebook commenters was saying a little earlier is that Africa and Africa's banks need to, of course, engage with the CARICOM nations and, of course, the SME. Favorably, we are seeing that taking place with regards to the Afri-Exim Bank. And they are usually four factors of production as I land. They are land, and Africa has more of it than any other place in the world. It is labor. We have the youngest population in the world and growing. And it is leadership. Africa wants for nothing in the area of leadership. But one of the Achilles' heels has always been access to liquidity. The World Bank and the IMF have been giving Africa loans at predatory interest rates, much higher than those that are afforded to America and, of course, Europe and other developed nations. So Dr. Arikana Shiambori Kwao makes the question, and I land with it. With regards to the issue, those who don't need get the money, and those who need don't get the money. That's how the situation goes. As we want to delve into the talk about BRICS within the context of the discourse, friend or foe for the African Union, friend or foe for Africa. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. As a learned academic and historian, they say there's nothing new under the sun. What are your thoughts? I certainly have a plethora of mine, but I want to start with yours, Baba. Because it's tied into all of this, the Afri-Exim Bank, what you just addressed in terms of reparations, BRICS, there's this allied group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They've now invited Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, as well as Ethiopia, Argentina, and Egypt to the fold now. What are your thoughts, friend or foe, ally or enemy, with regards to BRICS?
Yes, I like the theme opportunity or threat to Africa. I think we need to contextualize a bit for the listeners who may not be fully aware of BRICS. Most people may be. Of course, the organization was launched quite some time ago. I think the first time that foreign ministers met, it would have been the first four of the five, the BRIC countries, right? Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And they met in 2006. Then the heads of state first met in 2009, still four, countries. And then the following year, South Africa became a member of BRICS. So since 2010, from 2010 to 2023, I am not aware of any interest outside of the five nations wanting to expand BRICS. Suddenly something happened, and there was a plethora of requests to join, to become members. I am not 100% certain what happened, but I know that there was speculation, and for some people, there was hope that the BRICS Bank would be launching the new currency at the meeting they held in South Africa in August of this year. I think that excited a lot of people because with the onset of the NATO war against Russia, the weapon of sanctions kicked in even more, affected even more people than would have occurred previously, and therefore there was this imperative to get out from that stranglehold of the U.S. currency in particular, but also euro, but more particularly the U.S. How to find alternative ways of making payments and so on, but also how to be able, it's the same discussion we were having, to be able to access loans from international banks on a more equitable basis, and the BRICS Bank offered that kind of promise, away from the IMF with all its stringent requirements, that tend to put every single country that access the IMF into a lot of difficulties, particularly in the social sector, right? How to get away from that. So suddenly, I think one of the earliest interests was France, and that piqued my interest. Why would France want in on BRICS? Now, France had recently developed alternatives to the US dollar. So I think that emphasizes the point I'm making, that had to do with this widespread interest. Because if you look at the countries that want in, mostly they are countries that are in opposition, military, political, strategic opposition to the United States, right? Iran, a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, Venezuela, Uruguay, a lot of those countries, are not particularly favored by the United States. So most of the new interests were coming from those countries, right? And an expansion of African interests as well, where our focus is. Would Africa benefit from membership in BRICS? There could be a yes, there could be a maybe, right? But it depends on leadership, because whatever international organization countries are involved in, the benefits have to do with the quality of the leadership of those countries, right? But as it stands, I do not see BRICS as an obvious threat, because it means that we would have to question, the state of mind of all these African countries who want in on something that may be harmful to them. So obviously they do not see any harm in joining BRICS. So what are the possible benefits from joining BRICS? One of the definite benefits would be, of course, relief from the stranglehold of the United States dollar, either now or eventually, because while there's not a common currency, one of the policies being implemented by members of the BRICS, and even with the new members or new proposed members, would be trading in their own currency. So that's one of the features that a lot of countries who are members of BRICS would be encouraged to do. Whatever your currency is, there could be these bilateral arrangements with, within the BRICS itself, in terms of trading and making payments in your own currency. So even if that is all that emerges from this, I think it's an opportunity for African countries rather than a threat. But of course, If there are threats, it would have to be perhaps the way you negotiate your own membership and relationships with the rest of the countries. But overtly, I can't foresee that it could be a threat. If there are threats, I think the benefits outweigh the threats.
And I like that nuanced response because it analyzes Africa's need for capital. And I just want to acknowledge our growing Indaba audience on YouTube and on Facebook. Please like, share, comment. Our comment board is filled with so many statements that I can hardly read them all. One of them coming from Cheryl Africa says, Africa awaits its creators, Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. We're seeing other words from others in relation to the need for us to repatriate, to Africa in mass and droves, and the need for us to have mile-long ships in order to do so. But speaking to the issue of BRICS, you've hit the nail on the head. We need to have alternatives to IMF and World Bank, obviously. Under the new leadership of the New Development Bank, the former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, we see that per the last summit, there was a push towards the de-dollarization and the trading and the loans being given in the currency of the respective nations and countries. What that means is that regardless as to how your local currency pegs to the dollar, it floats, it fluctuates. In Trinidad and Tobago, it's 7-1 right now. In other nations, the volatility of the fluctuation is really large, really huge. And when that happens, we tend to see a scenario that you borrow under one set of conditions, but because your dollar, your currency has been devalued to the dollar, you now have to pay back not only the interest, but also the difference in terms of your currency's worth and value to that of the US dollar. I see toxicity, however, with us. I'm not sure if there's a caller on the line. Toxicity, if there's a caller, please. We'd like to take any calls that exist right now.
Currently, we don't have any calls on the line. And to give you a quick update, we have 2 minutes left for this evening's show. But thank you so much for including.
Thank you so much. As we wrap up, for the sake of the 91.1 FM Talk City audience, and we acknowledge you, the masses that are gathered there, those that are besides the Facebook and the YouTube audience, what would you say would be the best position for African countries contemplating entry into BRICS? So far, we have South Africa. Ethiopia has been given the nod. Egypt has been given the nod. Some people don't see Egypt as being African in the full sense of the word because of the style of leadership, etc. But that's beyond the point. The reality is that we have 3 nations out of Africa being included and many others applying because they want to have access to security. They want to have access to financing. They want to have access to support. Do you think that perhaps the African Union as a bloc should contemplate participation in BRICS in the way that they have entered into the G20 as a bloc? Do you think that bloc negotiation, that bloc strategy may work here in terms of the BRICS?
I cannot see how that can work since it is a country-based organization. It's like the United Nations. You can have a caucus of the AU in order to present a common front on certain policies, particularly policies that affect the strategic interests of the African Union as a body, But the more members you have, individual members, is the more clout you'll have. Because if the AU is one member, you have one vote. But if you have even half of the AU members, then you have you have 27 votes. And the votes must count for something, whether there is a stated, objective in terms of operating through some democratic means, the vote is one of the advantages that you have. United Nations, for example, they take Africa seriously with respect to certain issues because you can mobilize 54 votes, which is a quarter of the United Nations. And that's one of the things why they could not move against those African nations that decided not to support NATO in the war against Russia, because there were too many of them, you see. So that I would definitely say that the African Union as a single member would not be advantageous to Africa and the African states. I think African states should individually seek membership. But there are times when, if sufficient numbers of African countries are there, then you can mobilize, maybe as a region. If, for example, all West African countries become members, then ECOWAS could caucus as a region in order to push for certain advantages as member states of BRICS. So no, I don't see the African Union as a single member. I don't think there will be advantages for that.
And I see the wisdom and the logic in terms of your response. Talk City has just left. We are in overtime now as we wind down for the evening. We want to thank our YouTube audience. We certainly want to thank our Facebook audience. There's a question coming from Daniel Frederick, and I'm going to ask it so that you would have the opportunity to respond, Dr. Fergus. And it is a question that surrounds the following. Does access translate to a voice in determining policy and strategy? So as it relates to the issue of membership within BRICS, policy for BRICS, strategy for BRICS, we know China's pushing one belt, one road. We know that they have a really powerful trade route right now from Russia to China, to India, making its way to South Africa, making its way, of course, to Argentina when they are fully ratified in January. That whole southern corridor, they have access to all of that by way of a trade route within a bloc that defend and get behind one another. What say ye in terms of that question raised by Ms. Frederick? Access, a voice. Will that help to determine policy and strategy, or would we see that it's a type of neo-colonialism where the bigger fish, the big dogs, India, the largest population in the world, with nuclear technology, Russia, largest diamond producer in the world, powerful in so many ways, China, a juggernaut, producing all the world's steel and so much more as a country. Do you see smaller African nations getting into the politics, into the fray, into the membership of BRICS? Do you see them having the kind of voice and clout that can impact policy and strategy in a realistic way?
Well, BRICS originally came into being on the basis of economic power, economic strength. These countries were seen as emerging emerging as a competitor to the G20, G7, and so on. This kind of global economic powerhouses. This was the emerging powerhouse, because the term BRIC wasn't even coined by any member of BRIC. It was coined by one of these leading capitalist financial moguls in the United States, right? Who saw this perhaps as a threat, recognized it, gave it a name, and the name was adopted. It wasn't an unreasonable name, being an acronym, and they went with it. So initially, it was about economic power, so that an economically weak state would not find an equal footing in an organization that came into existence on the basis of economic empowerment and its economic strength. So I agree with that. Of course, Sister Danielle made a comment, but numbers don't translate into to power. Yes, but we are the same people who say that the power will reside with the people. Not the government, reside with the people. Even where there are dictatorships, we say power reside with the people. So there is an element that can be mobilized by true numbers when it comes to membership in organizations. So at a number of small states, outnumbering some of the bigger, more powerful, economically powerful states might be able to gain something out of it. But generally, BRICS originally, if they keep to the original thing, I think they're going to be selective in terms of who become members of BRICS. Because I don't think they want an organization where the economy of the states that become members, are so weak and, fragile, and the currency, as you mentioned, fluctuates so widely and all of that, within very short periods of time. I think those things could create problem for an organization like that. So they may screen these applicants for that kind of thing, because essentially it's an economic organization, huh?
Absolutely, absolutely. I have to agree with you. Ethiopia was not brought in by chance. It is certainly one of the largest African nations, most historic, certainly unbroken in terms of its history and heritage, and then a very fast-growing economy, notwithstanding the fact that it has been plunged for at least some time during the pandemic. They were battling on two fronts, not only the pandemic itself, but also a civil war. But yet they seem to have emerged out of that strong and continuing to grow by the grace of certainly the higher powers. We certainly would like to thank the audience for tuning in on tonight. The compliments are coming in. We see your questions. We see your comments. I want to recognize Prophet Cox. I want to recognize Daniel Frederick, Cheryl Africa. I want to also recognize Brother Lennox as well, Adiemi Hines. I think he would have tagged an eminent reparationist in Esther Stanford Corsi to the program tonight. I know that they're doing great work. There's a huge summit coming up in October. We are looking forward to that. Perhaps Adeyemi Ras, perhaps we can have Esther Stanford Corsi on the program in the near future to talk about the work that they are doing there in England as we are seeking to push the reparations agenda forward. Any last words coming from you? Closing remarks, Baba Fergus, as we wrap up tonight's edition of Indaba.
Yeah, before I do that, as you mentioned, Ethiopia, I think we can balance that with Nigeria, which was, rejected in a sense, because, what about the economies of these two countries that we're talking about? Nigeria is the largest economy in Africa, but the currency is so unstable, that perhaps, and the politics in a mess now, but, so they must be looking at something. I'm not sure what they're looking at, right? I want to just telegraph something. We would have a forum on reparations soon, let's say next week. Next week. Local reparations and discussion next week. I will clue you in on that further off air. But audience can look forward to something on reparations again next week from a more local perspective.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Again, pleasant good night to our listening audience on Facebook, on YouTube. All of those that chimed in to say good night, to ask a question, to give a comment. It is through you that Indaba is going to grow, that Indaba is going to rise again. We are Indaba, the voice of the Emancipation Support Committee, certainly the voice of the people, certainly the voice of the African diaspora. And in many, many ways, as we open the corridor and the door for those on the continent, certainly the voice for those on the continent, raising those issues here on this program that few touch, few there to talk about. We want to thank, of course, Ambassador David Commission for coming on the program and for sharing so eloquently, per usual. He's a mastercraft, as it were, a statesman and diplomat, and we know that he is going to be representing us quite well in Africa, Ghana, where this whole issue of reparations is going to be discussed there by all of the who is who. We are learning on tonight through Baba Fergus that Trinidad and Tobago is going to have its say sometime next week. And Rastafari would correct me. They would say, nah, not next week, only next strong. Talking about Rastafari, I want to big up Mickey Bo, who was here on tonight, Bongo Wisely as well, out of St. Lucia, and all of the others, again, who chimed in on tonight, liking, sharing, commenting. Again, this has been another edition of Indaba. Thank you so much for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you same time, same place. We're not out of love, not out of words, but we are certainly out of time for now. And with that, we sign off for tonight. A very pleasant good evening, and you are welcome to return.